Beneath today's glittering skyline of Chicago lies a forgotten world. A world of marshland, wild onions, fur traders, and tribal alliances. Before trains, factories, or skyscrapers, Chicago was a precarious strip of land, a crossroads fought over by empires and nations. But here's the shocker. This city, which would one day become the beating industrial heart of America, nearly didn't survive its birth. Chicago's history matters because it's not just the story of a city, it's a story of survival, conflict, ambition, and transformation. Its past explains why it grew so fast, why it became an industrial powerhouse, and why it still carries scars of struggle. Geography defined Chicago's destiny. The shallow Chicago portage linked Lake Michigan to the Des Plaines River. This fragile passage created a natural gateway between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River. Whoever controlled this crossing controlled trade routes that stretched from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. And that made this swampy patch of land one of the most valuable and contested sites in North America. Long before Europeans arrived, this region thrived with indigenous nations. The Illinois Confederation, Miami, and later the Potawatomi were central here. The Potawatomi, known as the Keepers of the Fire, were part of the larger Anishinaabe alliance with the Ojibwe and Odawa. They moved with the seasons, balancing hunting, fishing, and agriculture. In summer, they cultivated the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash. In winter, they moved inland for hunting deer, elk, and smaller game. In spring, they fished the rivers and tapped maple trees for sugar. In fall, they harvested wild rice in areas near wetlands. Their villages were semi-permanent, with bark houses and wigwams. Trade and diplomacy were vital. The Chicago River was not just water, it was a lifeline, a route for canoes carrying furs, food, and messages. The word Chicago itself, Chickaqua, meant wild onion or striped skunk. This was not an insult, but a reference to the abundant plants growing in the marshy soil. To indigenous peoples, the land was alive with meaning. But here's something rarely mentioned. When Europeans first stumbled across Chicago, they didn't see farmland or a city. They saw mud, mosquitoes, and hardship. Yet they also saw power, control of a portage that could change the fate of continents. The French were the first Europeans to map and record Chicago. In 1673, Louis Joliet and Father Jacques Marquette traveled through the Chicago portage. Their journey revealed that North America could be linked by water routes from Quebec down the Mississippi to New Orleans. This discovery was monumental. For France, it meant an empire spanning the continent. For Chicago, it marked its beginning as a crossroads. The French fur trade economy depended on beaver pelts, prized in Europe for making hats. By the late 1600s, the French had built a vast trade network through alliances with indigenous nations. Chicago became part of this system. Traders exchanged muskets, iron kettles, knives, beads, and cloth for furs. Indigenous peoples trapped beavers and transported furs through portages. Goods from Chicago traveled to Montreal, then across the Atlantic. For over a century, the French treated Chicago not as a colony, but as a vital outpost. No city, no farms, just trade, alliances, and influence. The French and Indian War, 1754 through 1763, ended with Britain seizing French territories. Chicago, though remote, passed into British control. But the British didn't invest in it. To them, Chicago was swampy and strategically minor. The Potawatomi and other nations remained dominant. Chicago was their land, their home. The British presence was weak. And when the American Revolution erupted, the region became a prize for the new United States. In the 1783 Treaty of Paris, Britain ceded the Northwest Territory, including Chicago, to the U.S. But again, this was a claim on paper. In reality, native nations controlled the ground. The United States knew the Chicago portage was valuable, but the frontier was dangerous. It wasn't until Jean-Baptiste Point du Sablé arrived that Chicago saw its first permanent settlement. Jean-Baptiste Point du Sablé is one of Chicago's most important but overlooked figures. Born around 1745, probably in Saint-Domingue, modern Haiti, he was of African descent. By the 1770s, du Sablé had made his way to the Great Lakes. At the mouth of the Chicago River, du Sablé built a homestead in the 1780s. He married a Potawatomi woman, Kitty Hawa, and together they raised a family. His farm was more than a house. It was an enterprise. He grew crops, corn, beans, squash, and fruit orchards. He raised livestock and maintained stables. He operated a mill and a smokehouse. He traded furs, produce, and goods with both native nations and travelers. Visitors described his home as prosperous and welcoming. Du Sablé's settlement became the nucleus of Chicago. Without him, there may have been no foundation for future growth. But du Sablé eventually left, selling his property around 1800. His departure remains mysterious. Some say due to illness, others to political pressure. Whatever the reason, the land he left behind became the seed of Chicago. The U.S. government recognized Chicago's strategic importance. In 1803, they built Fort Dearborn on the south bank of the Chicago River. It was a stockade with barracks, officers' quarters, and storage. Its purpose was clear: defend the portage, protect settlers, and project U.S. power. But the Potawatomi and other tribes saw the fort as a threat. To them, it was an intrusion on their homeland. When the War of 1812 broke out between the U.S. and Britain, Chicago became a flashpoint. In August 1812, Captain Nathan Heald received orders to evacuate Fort Dearborn. Heald's decision to destroy surplus gunpowder and liquor angered the Potawatomi, who saw it as betrayal. On August 15th, as the garrison marched south, they were ambushed. About 54 soldiers, women, and children were killed. The survivors were taken captive. The fort was burned to the ground. This event, remembered as the Fort Dearborn Massacre, nearly ended Chicago's story. For years afterward, the area was abandoned. Think about it. The first U.S. military presence in Chicago didn't survive a decade. If history had turned just slightly differently, Chicago might have disappeared forever. In 1816, the U.S. rebuilt Fort Dearborn. This time, they stayed. Over the next 2 decades, waves of settlers arrived. But this growth came at enormous cost to native nations. Through a series of treaties, indigenous peoples were forced to cede their lands. Treaty of Greenville, 1795. First American claim to the Chicago portage. Treaty of St. Louis, 1816. More land ceded around Chicago. Treaty of Chicago, 1833. The Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Odawa gave up all land in Illinois, agreeing to move west. By 1835, native presence was largely erased from Chicago. Settlers poured in, transforming the frontier into a growing town. In 1833, Chicago was incorporated as a town with about 350 people. By 1837, it became a city with over 4,000 residents. From this point forward, Chicago was no longer a fragile outpost. It was a rising star. But its path would not be easy. Fires, floods, and violence still lay ahead. From indigenous homeland to frontier outpost, from DuSable's homestead to the ashes of Fort Dearborn, Chicago's earliest story is one of survival against odds. By the 1830s, it was finally on the map. But the real transformation, the explosive growth, the industries, the disasters, and the triumphs was still to come. In 1830, Chicago was a swampy frontier town of a few hundred people. By 1890, it was the second largest city in the United States, home to more than 1 million souls. No other city in American history grew this fast. But how did it happen? How did a muddy riverside settlement become the beating industrial heart of the Midwest, and a city that defined America's rise? The 19th century was Chicago's crucible. Geography gave it opportunity, but human ambition, engineering, and relentless migration turned opportunity into empire. The forces that shaped Chicago's rise were fourfold. The canal, carving a water highway that bound east and west. The railroads, transforming Chicago into America's central hub. Immigration, waves of Irish, German, Scandinavian, Polish, Bohemian, and more. And industry, lumber, grain, meat, and steel. But this wasn't destiny. At every step, Chicago could have failed, choked by debt, burned by fire, drowned by its own swamp. Instead, it clawed its way upward with astonishing speed. By the 1830s, Americans were obsessed with canals. New York's Erie Canal, 1825, had proven that artificial waterways could transform cities into global trade centers. Leaders in Illinois wanted their own miracle. The dream was the Illinois and Michigan Canal, I&M Canal, linking the Chicago River to the Illinois River and from there to the Mississippi. It would finally make the Chicago portage a permanent artery of commerce. Construction began in 1836. It stretched 96 miles, connecting Chicago with LaSalle, Illinois. Thousands of Irish immigrants provided back-breaking labor, often under brutal conditions. Workers dug through swamp and prairie by hand, using shovels, wheelbarrows, and horse carts. The canal was plagued by debt and delays. Illinois nearly bankrupted itself financing the project. But when it finally opened in 1848, it changed everything. The canal allowed goods from the Mississippi Valley, grain, lumber, coal, to flow into Chicago and then eastward across the Great Lakes. Conversely, manufactured goods and settlers poured westward. Here's the twist. The same year the canal opened, so did Chicago's first railroad line. The canal that was supposed to guarantee Chicago's prosperity was already being eclipsed. Most people assume the I&M Canal built Chicago. The truth? It was only the opening act. The railroads would do far more and far faster. Railroads were Chicago's true lifeline. They transformed it from a regional outpost into the nation's transportation hub. The first line, the Galena and Chicago Union Railroad, began operating in 1848, carrying passengers and grain westward. Soon, dozens of lines radiated outward. To the east, connections to Detroit, Cleveland, and New York. To the west, Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, and beyond. To the south, St. Louis and New Orleans. By the 1850s, Chicago had become the rail capital of the nation. Every major line wanted to pass through it. Railroads solved a problem canals never could: speed and seasonality. Ice could shut down waterways for months, but trains ran year-round. Within a generation, Chicago was the busiest rail center in the world. One striking fact, by 1860, nearly all grain harvested in the Midwest passed through Chicago. Pause here. Think about this. Chicago didn't just grow because of railroads, it grew because it convinced America that all railroads must lead to Chicago. This was not inevitable, it was strategy, politics, and relentless boosterism. No city grows without people. Chicago's meteoric rise was fueled by immigration. Irish immigrants came first, fleeing famine and poverty, digging the canal and settling in poor districts. Germans followed, bringing skills as brewers, craftsmen, and farmers. By 1850, German was one of Chicago's dominant languages. Scandinavians, Swedes, and Norwegians established neighborhoods and churches, working in lumber and trades. Eastern Europeans, Poles, Bohemians, and others, arrived later in the century, building ethnic enclaves. Each group carved out its own neighborhood, often clashing with others, but also creating a patchwork of cultures. Chicago became one of the most ethnically diverse cities in America. Immigrants provided the labor that built Chicago's streets, laid its tracks, and fueled its factories. But they also built communities, schools, churches, and political machines that shaped the city's identity. Here's a startling number. Between 1830 and 1890, Chicago's population grew from 350 people to over 1 million. That's not just growth, it's an explosion unmatched in U.S. history. Chicago wasn't just a hub of people and trains, it became a hub of industry. Chicago sat at the gateway to the Great Lakes and northern forests. Logs were floated down from Wisconsin and Michigan, then processed in Chicago sawmills. By the 1850s, Chicago was the nation's largest lumber market. The city pioneered innovations in storing and selling grain. In 1848, the same year the canal opened, the Chicago Board of Trade, or CBOT, was founded. The CBOT introduced the concept of grain grading, separating wheat and corn into standardized categories. This made Chicago the first city to use futures contracts, revolutionizing global trade. Perhaps the most iconic industry was meat. Chicago became America's butcher. Hogs and cattle arrived by train and river. Packing houses processed them with brutal efficiency. By mid-century, Chicago was the meat-packing capital of the United States. Later, these stockyards would become infamous in Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. But in the mid-1800s, they were celebrated as proof of Chicago's industrial might. And yet, beneath this triumph was fragility. Chicago's boom was so fast, so chaotic, that it was constantly on the edge of collapse. Fires swept through wooden neighborhoods, floods drowned streets, diseases thrived in crowded immigrant districts. The city's success was inseparable from its instability. By 1857, Chicago's population had passed 90,000. Its streets were choked with mud, sewage, and animals. The rapid expansion had outpaced infrastructure. To survive, Chicago turned to engineering marvels, raising the city. In the 1850s, engineers literally lifted entire blocks of buildings to install sewers beneath them. Massive jack screws elevated hotels, stores, and houses several feet. Reversing the river. Early discussions began about how to prevent sewage from contaminating Lake Michigan, Chicago's drinking water source. This would culminate later in one of the greatest engineering feats in U.S. history. Chicago's very survival depended on human determination to bend nature to its will. By the eve of the Civil War, Chicago had secured its destiny. It was no longer a frontier outpost. It was the transportation hub of the nation, the center of grain, lumber, and meat, and a magnet for immigrants. In just a few decades, Chicago had gone from swamp to empire. Its rise was faster than any city before it. But this speed came with risks. Overcrowding, political corruption, and environmental disaster all loomed. And soon, the Great Fire would test whether the city could survive at all. This is not just the story of a fire. It is the story of death and survival, ruin and rebirth, and how a city rose from smoldering rubble to redefine modern urban life. By 1871, Chicago had become the unthinkable. In less than 4 decades since its incorporation, it had surged past rivals like St. Louis and Cincinnati to become the transportation and industrial heart of the Midwest. Grain, lumber, and livestock poured in from across the prairies and forests, funneled through the city's railroads and canals to markets as far away as Europe. But success brought risk. The same forces that made Chicago rich also made it fragile. A wooden city built on marshland, narrow streets crammed with warehouses and homes, an industrial hub powered by open flames, oil lamps, and coal stoves. A city bursting at the seams and yet held together with lumber that could burn like kindling. All it would take was a spark. In the decades leading up to 1871, Chicago was a city defined by extremes. It was growing faster than any city in the United States, doubling its population nearly every decade. By 1870, it boasted more than 300,000 residents, a blend of native-born Americans, Irish laborers, German craftsmen, Scandinavian farmers, and Polish immigrants, all seeking opportunity. But beneath the prosperity lay vulnerability. Over 2/3 of the city's structures were built from wood, including homes, sidewalks, bridges, and even the roads themselves paved with wooden blocks. Tar and resin coated rooftops, while hay-filled barns stood within city limits. In summer, drought baked the land dry. In fall, prairie winds whipped through streets like bellows. And in 1871, Chicago suffered its worst drought in memory. From July through October, only a quarter of the normal rainfall fell. By October, the city was a tinderbox waiting for disaster. On the evening of Sunday, October 8, 1871, fire broke out on the city's west side. The now legendary version places the blame on Mrs. O'Leary's cow, said to have kicked over a lantern in a barn on DeKoven Street. In truth, no definitive cause was ever proven. But what is certain is this. A fire began in the O'Leary family's barn, and within minutes, flames spread to adjoining sheds and houses. The city's fire department was already exhausted. Just the night before, a massive blaze had consumed 4 blocks, and firefighters were still weary from battling the flames. When alarms rang, crews rushed to the wrong location, misdirected by a watchman's error. By the time engines arrived, the fire had gained deadly momentum. Winds gusted at 30 miles per hour, fanning sparks across rooftops and into the heart of the city. Wooden sidewalks ignited like fuses, carrying flames block to block. By midnight, the fire leapt the south branch of the Chicago River, setting ablaze lumber yards and warehouses filled with fuel for the flames. The destruction became apocalyptic. Wooden bridges caught fire, trapping fleeing crowds. Flaming debris hurled across the river again, igniting the central business district. Stone and brick buildings that residents thought would withstand the fire collapsed as heat shattered their facades. Gas mains exploded beneath the streets. By dawn on Monday, October 9th, the fire consumed the courthouse, the Chamber of Commerce, hotels, theaters, and entire neighborhoods. That night, gale-force winds drove the fire northward, across the river once more, into densely packed immigrant districts. Families fled toward Lincoln Park and the shores of Lake Michigan. Thousands found themselves huddled on the beaches, surrounded by smoke, as the city burned behind them. The fire raged for 30 hours, finally subsiding by the afternoon of Tuesday, October 10th, when winds died and a light rain fell. The toll was staggering. The fire destroyed more than 17,000 buildings, left 100,000 people homeless, nearly 1/3 of the population. and killed an estimated 300 people, though some historians believe the death toll was higher. Entire districts were gone. The commercial core, government buildings, warehouses, mills, churches, and the homes of both the wealthy and the poor. The ruins stretched for miles, smoldering rubble, blackened chimneys, twisted iron, and the acrid stench of smoke and death. But here's the twist. Chicago was not finished. Here's where history surprises us. Instead of destroying Chicago's future, the Great Fire unlocked it. Why? Because amid the devastation lay a chance to rebuild bigger, stronger, and smarter. The city's location, its railroads, canals, and access to the Midwest's resources remained untouched. Its people, though battered, were resilient and determined. And within days, help poured in from across the nation and the world. Relief trains arrived from Milwaukee, St. Louis, and Cincinnati, bringing food, blankets, and medical supplies. Donations flowed from New York, Boston, London, Paris, and even small towns across America. The fire had made Chicago a national cause. The rebuilding of Chicago became one of the greatest urban reconstruction projects in history. Within weeks, temporary structures housed businesses and families. Lumber shipments arrived daily from Wisconsin and Michigan. Merchants set up shop and hastily built sheds dubbed the Phoenix Buildings. But rebuilding wasn't just about replacing what was lost. It was about transformation. City leaders banned wooden buildings in the downtown core, mandating fireproof materials like brick, stone, and iron. Architects and engineers experimented with new techniques, laying the foundation for what would become the modern skyscraper. The rebuilding also created opportunity for the working poor and immigrants. Thousands found jobs clearing rubble, hauling stone, and constructing new buildings. The economy roared back with astonishing speed. Within 2 years, Chicago's population had recovered, and by 1880, it surpassed 500,000 residents. The Great Fire is remembered as a tragedy, but its true legacy is paradoxical. Without it, Chicago might never have become the city we know today, the birthplace of modern architecture, the testing ground for steel frame construction, and the global hub of commerce it would soon become. So the Great Fire of 1871 was not just the end of one Chicago, it was the beginning of another. A city that rose from ashes to steel, from ruin to innovation. The next time you walk the streets of downtown Chicago, look up. The skyline above you, the soaring towers of glass and steel, stand as descendants of a fire that nearly destroyed everything. The Great Fire was both a catastrophe and a rebirth. But the story doesn't end there. Because as Chicago rebuilt itself into a beacon of progress, new challenges awaited. Labor unrest, corruption, waves of immigration, and the struggle for social justice. And those struggles would define the next era of Chicago's history. What if the very fire that nearly destroyed Chicago became the spark that ignited both its golden age of wealth and its darkest age of struggle? What if, behind the glittering mansions and booming industries, a battle brewed between millionaires, workers, immigrants, and reformers, each fighting to shape the city's destiny? This is the Chicago of the Gilded Age, a city of dazzling progress and crushing inequality. A place where fortunes were made in a single deal, but where thousands lived in crowded tenements barely surviving. By the late 19th century, Chicago had risen from the ashes of the Great Fire with astonishing speed. It wasn't just rebuilt, it was reborn as a global city. Railroads, factories, and skyscrapers announced its arrival on the world stage, but prosperity was uneven. Behind the glitter of the new skyline was a city seething with tension. Chicago became a battleground for the central struggles of America's Gilded Age, the clash between capital and labor, the struggles of new immigrants, the fight for women's and workers' rights, and the corruption that seeped through politics. To understand this city, we must walk its streets, from the opulent mansions of Prairie Avenue to the smoke-filled factories of the West Side, and from the Board of Trade's marble halls to the crowded immigrant ghettos. Each revealed a different face of Gilded Age Chicago. After the fire, Chicago rebuilt with ambition. By the 1880s, it was the fastest-growing city in the United States. The population leapt from 300,000 in 1870 to over 1 million by 1890. The rebuilding created jobs, but also sparked an architectural revolution. William LeBaron Jenney introduced the steel frame construction that made skyscrapers possible. His home insurance building, 1885, just 10 stories tall, was the first of its kind. Soon, architects like Louis Sullivan and Dankmar Adler transformed Chicago into a laboratory of modern design, combining function with ornamentation in ways the world had never seen. But while the skyline soared, the ground-level reality for many was harsher. Factories churned out meat, steel, lumber, farm equipment, and consumer goods. The Union Stockyards, opened in 1865, became the beating heart of the meatpacking industry. Rail lines radiated outward, bringing cattle and hogs from across the Midwest. Workers slaughtered and processed millions of animals each year, sending meat to markets worldwide. Industrial giants emerged: Philip Armour and Gustavus Swift in meatpacking, George Pullman in railcars, and Marshall Field in retail. Their names became synonymous with wealth and influence. But with industry came inequality. Workers toiled for 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, in dangerous conditions. Wages barely supported families. Accidents were common, and there were no protections. No workers' compensation, no safety laws, no unions strong enough to demand change. Chicago's growth was fueled by immigration. Germans, Irish, Scandinavians, and Czechs had arrived earlier, but after 1880, new waves came. Polish, Italians, Russians, Lithuanians, and Jews fleeing persecution. African Americans, too, began moving north in what would later swell into the Great Migration. Each community carved out its own neighborhood. Pilsen became home to Czechs and Poles. Bridgeport was Irish. Maxwell Street thrived as a Jewish market district. But these communities also lived in crowded tenements with no running water, poor sanitation, and rampant disease. Infant mortality rates soared. Yet immigrants also brought resilience, traditions, and culture. They built churches, schools, and newspapers in their own languages. They formed mutual aid societies to care for the sick and unemployed. Chicago became a city of languages, festivals, and faiths. Its strength found in diversity. But here's the contradiction. While immigrants lived in crowded tenements, just a few miles away, millionaires flaunted their fortunes. Prairie Avenue, on the south side, became the city's version of Fifth Avenue in New York. Mansions built by Pullman, Armour, and Field dazzled with chandeliers, marble staircases, and art collections imported from Europe. The contrast between rich and poor was sharper in Chicago than almost anywhere else in America. It was a city where gilded luxury and grinding poverty existed side by side, fueling resentment and unrest. Chicago became the epicenter of labor conflict in America. Workers began to organize, demanding shorter hours, better pay, and safer conditions. The most dramatic showdown came with the Haymarket Affair of 1886. Workers across the nation were striking for the 8-hour workday. In Chicago, a peaceful rally on May 4th turned violent when someone threw a bomb at police. The explosion killed 7 officers and several civilians. Gunfire followed. In the aftermath, 8 anarchists were arrested and convicted, despite scant evidence linking them to the bombing. 4 were executed, becoming martyrs for labor movements worldwide. The Haymarket Affair symbolized both the desperation of workers and the fear of authorities. Meanwhile, Chicago's politics were notoriously corrupt. The Democratic machine dominated, fueled by immigrant votes and patronage jobs. Business leaders wielded enormous influence, shaping laws and city contracts to their advantage. Mayors like Carter Harrison Sr. played the populist card, charming working-class voters while balancing the demands of powerful elites. But graft, bribery, and backroom deals were everyday realities. For many, Chicago became the very symbol of Gilded Age political corruption. By the dawn of the 1890s, Chicago stood as America's paradox. It was the nation's second-largest city, its railroads and factories essential to the economy. Its architecture inspired the world. Its businessmen amassed fortunes that rivaled kings. Yet at the same time, Chicago was a powder keg. Its workers restless, its poor overcrowded, its politics corrupt. It was a city of contrasts, skyscrapers and slums, millionaires and beggars, democracy and machine politics. The Gilded Age made Chicago powerful but unstable. The same forces that built its wealth, industry, immigration, and ambition, also sowed the seeds of unrest. And soon, those tensions would explode into some of the most dramatic moments in American history. The World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 would showcase Chicago as the White City, the shining example of American progress. But at the very same time, depression, strikes, and violence would show the darker side of that dream. In 1893, Chicago stunned the world. Out of swampland and smoke, the city conjured a dreamlike wonder, the World's Columbian Exposition. White palaces, gleaming under electric lights, rose from Jackson Park as if by magic. It was the White City, a vision of order, beauty, and progress, so dazzling that 27 million people came to see it. But behind the splendor lay shadows. While visitors marveled at the grand boulevards and glittering architecture, Chicago's working poor suffered through depression, strikes, and hunger. And in the city's darker corners, a predator stalked, leaving behind one of the most infamous crime stories in American history. This is the tale of Chicago at its height and its breaking point, of triumph, illusion, and secrets that still haunted streets. The 1890s brought Chicago to a crossroads. The city had rebuilt after the Great Fire and become the industrial heart of America, but it also faced unrest, labor battles, corruption, and overcrowding. Hosting a World's Fair would be both a celebration and a gamble. Chicago won the bid to host the World's Columbian Exposition, commemorating the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas, after a fierce rivalry with New York, Washington, and St. Louis. For Chicago's leaders, this was their chance to prove the city had not only recovered from disaster, but surpassed every rival as America's rising metropolis. The fair would not only change Chicago, it would change the world. The vision for the fair came from Chicago's elite. Businessmen like Marshall Field, George Pullman, and Philip Armour saw it as a way to showcase wealth and power. Politicians pushed it as proof of Chicago's destiny. Architect Daniel Burnham and landscape designer Frederick Olmsted were tasked with bringing the dream to life. Burnham directed construction with ruthless determination, declaring, "Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood." Olmsted sculpted the swampy grounds of Jackson Park into lagoons and promenades. It was an impossible task. Build a city within a city with monumental structures, gardens, exhibits, and innovations, all in just 2 years. Yet, against all odds, they did it. When the gates opened in May 1893, visitors entered another world. The fairground spanned 600 acres, with more than 200 buildings, all designed in a uniform neoclassical style, their plaster facades glowing white. Broad boulevards, fountains, and lagoons reflected the grandeur. At night, electric lights bathed the grounds in a glow never before seen on such a scale. This was the White City, a vision of order, beauty, and progress. It symbolized what Chicago and America wanted to be: modern, powerful, and destined for greatness. Inside, wonders awaited. The Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building was the largest building in the world, covering more than 30 acres. The Electricity Building showcased the new miracles of light and power, including Nikola Tesla's alternating current system. The Agricultural Building, Mines and Mining Building, and Transportation Building displayed the wealth of industries. And towering above it all stood the Ferris wheel, 264 feet tall, created by Ferris to rival Paris's Eiffel Tower. Each car held 60 people, giving them a view of the entire city. It became the symbol of the fair and of American ingenuity. Over 6 months, more than 27 million people came: farmers, immigrants, presidents, royalty, inventors, and artists. President Grover Cleveland opened the fair. Scott Joplin performed ragtime. Buffalo Bill Cody set up his Wild West show just outside the gates, drawing crowds of his own. People came to marvel at electric lights, moving sidewalks, and new inventions. They tasted new foods: juicy fruit gum, cream of wheat, Pabst Blue Ribbon beer. They saw the debut of cultural icons like the hamburger, the zipper, and the dishwasher. The fair introduced the world to products and ideas that would shape modern life. But here's the twist. Outside the fairgrounds, Chicago was in crisis. The Panic of 1893 struck, plunging the nation into one of its worst depressions. Banks failed. Railroads went bankrupt. Thousands lost jobs. In Chicago, unemployment soared. Families went hungry. Strikes and protests grew violent. While the White City glowed, the real city struggled. The fair became both a dream and an escape, a temporary illusion of progress while hardship spread. And there was another shadow. Amid the crowds of fairgoers, a predator lurked. H. Holmes, later dubbed America's first serial killer, built his infamous murder castle in nearby Englewood. Disguised as a hotel for fair visitors, it was a labyrinth of hidden rooms, trapdoors, and soundproof chambers. Holmes lured victims, mostly young women seeking work or opportunity, and killed them, their fates concealed within his sinister building. The White City and the Murder Castle, light and darkness, became symbols of Chicago's dual nature. Despite the depression, the fair dazzled the world. It showed that Chicago had not only rebuilt, but had become a world-class city. The exposition inspired movements in architecture, urban planning, and culture. Burnham's vision of order and beauty helped shape the City Beautiful movement, influencing cities across America. The fair's use of electricity, mass entertainment, and new technology marked the arrival of the modern age. But the fair also highlighted contradictions. The exhibits celebrated American progress, yet often excluded African Americans, Native Americans, and working-class voices. While the White City stood for beauty and progress, many saw it as an illusion, a gleaming facade hiding inequality. In 1893, for 6 months, Chicago was the center of the world. The White City drew more visitors than any event in American history. It left behind architecture, inventions, and inspiration that shaped the century to come. But as the fair closed, the depression deepened. Strikes and unrest loomed. Chicago's next chapter would be one of conflict: workers against capital, neighborhoods against elites, reformers against corruption. The White City was both a triumph and a warning. By the turn of the 20th century, Chicago was a city of contradictions. Dazzling skyscrapers rose beside crowded tenements. Industry churned relentlessly, and the streets echoed with the footsteps of workers demanding dignity. It was a city built by labor, yet ruled by capital, a place where ambition clashed with oppression, and where ordinary people risked everything to shape their own future. This is the story of Chicago's early 20th century, a city of strikes, protests, political battles, and social upheaval that would define not just its identity, but the nation's. After the triumph of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, Chicago seemed unstoppable. Railroads carried its goods across the nation, meatpacking and manufacturing dominated the economy, and skyscrapers transformed its skyline. Yet beneath this progress simmered tension. Workers, many of them immigrants, faced grueling hours, low pay, and unsafe conditions. Women labored in factories and sweatshops, often for pennies a day. The city's political machines protected business interests while ignoring the needs of ordinary citizens. Chicago became the proving ground for America's labor movement. Strikes, riots, and legal battles erupted repeatedly, exposing the fragile balance between power and justice. The early 1900s cemented Chicago as an industrial powerhouse. Meatpacking, steel, railcar manufacturing, and brewing flourished. Giants like Philip Armour, Gustavus Swift, and George Pullman dominated the economy. But the workforce paid a steep price. Hours, 10 to 12 hours per day, 6 days a week. Conditions, dangerous machinery, poor ventilation, and exposure to chemicals and disease. Pay, often barely enough to survive, especially for women and children. Child labor was widespread. Children worked in factories, laundries, and street trades. Schools were optional for many immigrant families struggling to survive. This exploitation created a fertile ground for labor organizing. Workers formed unions, often in secret, risking blacklisting, eviction, and violence. The Haymarket Affair of 1886 had already left a mark on Chicago. Its lessons were still fresh. Government often sided with business, and calls for justice could provoke deadly repression. Workers approached unionization cautiously but determinedly, learning from past mistakes. By 1899, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union and other labor groups were organizing strikes across the city. The goal was simple: fair wages, reasonable hours, and safe working conditions. One of the most significant labor conflicts in Chicago occurred at the Pullman Company, which manufactured luxury rail cars. George Pullman, seeking to control both the factory and the town he built for workers, cut wages without reducing rents in the company-owned town. Workers struck. The strike escalated, and by June 1894, the American Railway Union, led by Eugene V. Debs, called for a nationwide boycott of Pullman railcars. Rail traffic ground to a halt, spreading disruption across the Midwest. The federal government intervened, sending troops to break the strike. Violence erupted, leaving more than 25 dead and hundreds injured. The Pullman strike became a defining moment in U.S. labor history, illustrating the tensions between capital, government, and workers. Meanwhile, Chicago continued to attract immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. Poles, Italians, Lithuanians, and Slovaks formed tight-knit communities in neighborhoods like Pilsen, Back of the Yards, and Little Italy. These communities built churches, schools, and mutual aid societies, preserving their culture while integrating into the city's economy. But social tensions were constant. Competition for jobs fueled ethnic conflicts. Nativist sentiments sometimes erupted into riots. Poverty and overcrowding made immigrant districts flashpoints for disease and unrest. Women played a critical role in social reform, founding organizations like the Hull House, led by Jane Addams, to provide education, childcare, and support for the urban poor. These reformers laid the groundwork for progressive movements across the nation. The early 20th century was marked by repeated labor conflicts. Notable events include the 1903 garment workers' strike. Female garment workers protested unsafe conditions and low pay. Employers hired strike bakers, and clashes often turned violent. The 1910 Chicago Teamsters strike. Truck drivers, many recent immigrants, struck against wage cuts and long hours. Police intervention and mob violence escalated the conflict. Through these struggles, Chicago became a crucible for labor reform. Unions grew stronger, regulations slowly improved, and workers began asserting their rights in ways that would echo nationally. By 1910, Chicago was not just an industrial city, it was a battleground of labor, ethnicity, and social reform. Its streets, factories, and neighborhoods reflected the clash of power and justice. The successes of Chicago, the towering skyscrapers, booming railroads, and industrial might, coexisted with profound social struggle.
Imagine a city pulsing with music, nightlife, and forbidden thrills, where the clink of glasses in hidden speakeasies echoed alongside the roar of machine guns in alleyways. This was Chicago in the 1920s, a city transformed by prohibition, jazz, and ambition, where opportunity and danger walked side by side. It was a time of wealth and glamour, of flappers and factories, but also of gangsters and corruption. Chicago had entered an era where its streets were both a playground and a battlefield. The decade after World War I brought rapid social, cultural, and economic change. Chicago's population had surged past 2.7 million by 1920, fueled by migration from the South and immigration from Europe. Industries boomed, while the newly wealthy sought entertainment and escape. But the 18th Amendment, prohibiting alcohol, inadvertently created an entirely new economy, one ruled not by factories, banks, or railroads, but by gangs, bootleggers, and criminal enterprises. Chicago became the epicenter of America's underworld, and its stories of crime, violence, and cunning continue to fascinate the world. With the onset of Prohibition in 1920, alcohol was outlawed across the United States, but demand did not disappear. In Chicago, enterprising gangsters filled the gap, creating vast networks for smuggling, distilling, and distributing liquor. Al Capone, the most infamous gangster of the era, became a household name. Capone and his gang controlled Chicago's South Side, running speakeasies, bribing police and politicians, and violently eliminating rivals. The Chicago outfit became a symbol of organized crime nationwide. Bootlegging transformed the economy. Illegal alcohol flowed in barrels from Canada, Europe, and domestic stills. Speakeasies thrived in basements and back rooms. Flappers and socialites danced to jazz, while gang violence escalated on the streets. While gangs dominated headlines, Chicago was also a cultural beacon. Jazz, blues, and ragtime flourished in Chicago's nightclubs. Musicians from the South, particularly African-American artists fleeing segregation, brought the Delta sound to Chicago's South Side. Clubs like the Royal Garden Cafe and Lincoln Gardens hosted legends such as Louis Armstrong and Jelly Roll Morton. Chicago became a hub for innovation in music, dance, and nightlife. The city's theaters and concert halls drew crowds eager for entertainment, while newspapers chronicled both the glamour and the chaos. Jazz symbolized a new era, one of liberation, experimentation, and cultural fusion. But here's the twist. Chicago's glamour coexisted with danger. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929 shocked the nation. 7 members of Bugs Moran's North Side Gang were lined up against a garage wall and shot execution style by Capone's men. This single event revealed the deadly reality of Chicago's underworld. Gang wars weren't just headlines. They were battles for control over neighborhoods, speakeasies, and bootlegging routes. Innocent bystanders were often caught in the crossfire. Meanwhile, corruption extended beyond gangs. Politicians, police officers, and city officials were often on the take, creating a system where power and protection could be bought for the right price. Chicago's growth in the 1920s was fueled by both European immigrants and African Americans fleeing the Jim Crow South. The Great Migration brought tens of thousands of African Americans to the South and West Sides, seeking industrial jobs and new opportunities. This influx reshaped the city's demographics and culture. African American neighborhoods became centers of music, art, and activism. Yet racial tensions were high. Competition for jobs and housing led to segregation and frequent clashes, including race riots in 1919, whose effects reverberated into the 1920s. Immigrant communities also expanded, creating vibrant enclaves such as Little Italy, Greektown, and Pilsen. They maintained cultural traditions while contributing to the city's labor force, arts, and cuisine. The 1920s economy was booming. Factories produced automobiles, appliances, and consumer goods. Railroads, shipping, and meatpacking thrived. Entrepreneurs built wealth, and the stock market soared. Yet prosperity was uneven. Many workers labored long hours for low pay. Immigrants and African Americans were often relegated to the least desirable jobs. Rent in overcrowded neighborhoods was high, and social services were limited. Chicago's glittering streets masked the struggles of its working-class residents. Labor movements continued to fight for rights, though prohibition and gang violence complicated organizing. Some unions adapted, while others struggled against both business interests and crime influence. Social reformers, inspired by earlier work at Hull House and other initiatives, pushed for housing, sanitation, and educational improvements. Women became increasingly prominent in activism, pushing for suffrage, workplace reforms, and public health campaigns. Chicago became a laboratory for social change, even amidst chaos. The Roaring Twenties embodied Chicago's duality: wealth and poverty, innovation and crime, cultural brilliance and social tension. Jazz clubs and speakeasies thrived alongside gangland murders. Millionaires built opulent homes while thousands struggled in tenements. Chicago's skyline reached new heights, and its streets teemed with energy. But the city also faced systemic corruption, organized crime, and inequality that would shape its destiny for decades to come. Picture a city frozen in despair, yet brimming with resilience. Factories fell silent, unemployment soared, and bread lines stretched for blocks. This was Chicago during the Great Depression, where the city's industrial heart had slowed to a painful beat, and yet its people refused to surrender.
Amid the collapse, Chicago became a testing ground for survival strategies, social programs, and grassroots activism. It was a city facing its greatest economic and social challenge, but also a city that would emerge stronger, shaped by the struggles and sacrifices of its residents. By 1929, Chicago's economic engine, the factories, stockyards, and railroads, was thriving. But the Wall Street crash sent shockwaves through the city almost immediately. Industries cut production, banks failed, and unemployment skyrocketed. Families lost homes, children went hungry, entire neighborhoods teetered on the edge of collapse. Yet the city's response was as dramatic as the crisis itself. Relief programs, labor activism, and community networks emerged to help those in need. Chicago became a city of collective endurance, where hardship sparked innovation, solidarity, and social change. The Depression hit Chicago's economy hard. Major employers like meatpacking companies, steel mills, and railroads laid off thousands of workers. By 1933, nearly 1 in 4 Chicagoans was unemployed. Banks failed, wiping out savings for countless families. Mortgage foreclosures and evictions increased, pushing working-class families into overcrowded apartments or shantytowns, sometimes called Hoovervilles. The stockyards, once the city's economic lifeblood, slowed dramatically. Meatpacking jobs that had fueled immigrant communities vanished almost overnight. The ripple effect hit retail, transportation, and small businesses, creating a citywide crisis of survival. Communities responded with ingenuity. Churches, charitable organizations, and local activists organized soup kitchens and bread lines. Social clubs and immigrant aid societies provided food, shelter, and moral support. Photographs from the era, famously captured by the Farm Security Administration, show children in worn clothing, mothers holding infants in line for food, and men carrying their meager belongings through city streets. These images reveal both desperation and dignity, hardship and endurance. Local newspapers like the Chicago Tribune documented the human toll, while also highlighting acts of heroism, generosity, and solidarity. The Depression reignited labor activism. Chicago saw numerous strikes as workers fought for wages, hours, and job security. Among the most notable, the 1934 General Strike. Truck drivers and warehouse workers struck for better pay, drawing national attention. Steel and packing house strikes, workers demanded humane conditions in industries still recovering from the economic collapse. Labor organizers faced violent pushback from employers and sometimes law enforcement, echoing the city's earlier struggles in the Gilded Age and Progressive era. But persistent activism gradually reshaped labor laws and worker protections. The crisis forced city leaders to act. Mayor Edward J. Kelly and later Mayor Anton Cermak attempted to coordinate relief programs, often navigating a web of corruption, bureaucracy, and political machines. Chicago also benefited from federal programs under President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. Works Progress Administration, WPA, created jobs in construction, public works, and arts programs. Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, employed young men in environmental and infrastructure projects. Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERA, provided direct aid to struggling families. These programs were lifelines for thousands of Chicagoans and helped the city maintain infrastructure, schools, and public services during the darkest years of the Depression. The economic hardship fueled crime in the city. With desperation at a peak, petty theft, bootlegging, still ongoing in the early 1930s, and organized criminal activity rose. Some former gangsters shifted focus to new opportunities, exploiting the unemployed and impoverished. Yet crime was only a small part of the story. The Depression also inspired community resilience. Neighbors shared resources, immigrant associations helped newcomers, and labor unions built networks of support. Despite hardship, Chicago remained a cultural hub. Theaters, music venues, and churches became centers for community morale. African-American migration continued, shaping neighborhoods such as Bronzeville, which became a center of music, literature, and intellectual life. Institutions like Hull House, the Chicago Urban League, and new labor unions provided education, vocational training, and advocacy. Social reformers, many women, worked tirelessly to improve health, housing, and welfare, laying foundations for future urban policy. Chicago also nurtured literary and artistic movements. Writers and journalists documented the human struggle, creating a narrative of endurance that would define the city's identity for generations. By 1933, Chicago had endured years of economic devastation, social upheaval, and widespread hardship. But the city's resilience was evident. Communities adapted through mutual aid and grassroots networks. Workers fought for fair treatment, pushing labor reforms. Cultural life persisted, reflecting creativity and hope amid despair. The Great Depression reshaped Chicago, not just economically, but socially and culturally. It exposed inequality while highlighting collective strength.
But this was more than an industrial revival. Chicago became a magnet for migration, a laboratory of social transformation, and a city reinventing itself for the modern age. The seeds of its contemporary skyline, neighborhoods, and culture were being sown amidst the thunder of assembly lines and the rhythm of change.
The 1940s brought global conflict to the world's doorstep, and Chicago was in the midst of it. Its factories, rail yards, and ports were vital to the war effort. The city's population surged, driven by African-American migration from the South and new European immigrants seeking opportunity. While the war brought prosperity, it also created tension. Housing shortages, racial friction, and labor disputes became urgent challenges. Chicago was both a symbol of America's industrial might and a city grappling with the inequalities and pressures of rapid growth. Chicago's industries, dormant or struggling during the Great Depression, roared back to life with wartime demand. Steel mills, rail car manufacturers, and meatpacking plants operated at full capacity. The Hawthorne Works, Pullman factories, and steel mills produced vehicles, arms, and equipment vital for the Allied forces. Women, who had taken on industrial jobs in unprecedented numbers, became a visible and powerful force in the workforce. Chicago mirrored national trends. Rosie the Riveter was not just a symbol, it was reality in Chicago's factories, shipyards, and assembly lines. This industrial revival ended the high unemployment of the Depression and generated enormous wealth. Yet it also exposed inequalities. African-American workers were often funneled into lower-paying, more dangerous positions, and immigrant communities faced continued discrimination. The war accelerated the second-rate migration, with African Americans leaving the rural South for industrial jobs in Chicago. By the mid-1940s, Chicago's black population had grown dramatically, particularly in neighborhoods like Bronzeville and South Shore. At the same time, European immigrants and their descendants continued to shape the city's neighborhoods. Polish, Italian, Irish, and Scandinavian communities expanded, bringing culture, commerce, and political influence. This migration created both opportunity and tension. Housing shortages forced overcrowding, and competition for jobs and schools sometimes led to racial and ethnic clashes. The city's social fabric was being rewoven under the pressures of war, industry, and mobility. While factories churned and neighborhoods expanded, Chicago faced challenges beneath the surface. Racial segregation, overcrowding, and inequality persisted. Labor disputes continued as unions sought better conditions for workers, contributing to the war effort. At the same time, the city became a hub for wartime innovation. Chicago's universities, laboratories, and industry collaborated on critical technological and scientific developments, laying the groundwork for post-war economic and academic dominance. After 1945, the war ended, but Chicago's momentum did not. Veterans returned, industries shifted from wartime production to consumer goods, and the city's economy diversified. Automobiles, appliances, and construction fueled growth, and Chicago became a center for trade, finance, and innovation. Suburban expansion accelerated. Highways, commuter trains, and new housing developments drew middle-class families out of the city's core, reshaping neighborhoods and creating socioeconomic divisions that would persist for decades. Yet the urban core remained vibrant. Downtown skyscrapers rose higher, cultural institutions flourished, and immigrant and black communities continued to define the city's character. Chicago was a city transformed, dynamic, diverse, and increasingly modern. Bronzeville became a center of African-American culture, producing jazz, blues, literature, and political activism. Chicago newspapers, theaters, and music venues reflected the city's diverse populations and creative energy. Universities, such as University of Chicago and Northwestern, expanded research programs, fueling innovation in economics, social sciences, and technology. Chicago was emerging not just as an industrial powerhouse, but also as a cultural, intellectual, and civic center. By the early 1950s, Chicago had undergone a dramatic transformation. Economically, it had recovered from the Depression and wartime disruptions, establishing industrial dominance. Demographically, migration had reshaped neighborhoods, creating new cultural vibrancy and social challenges. Culturally, it had emerged as a hub for music, literature, and intellectual life. The city's skyline, population, and industries were preparing it to take its place as a true American metropolis. Yet the underlying social tensions, segregation, and political corruption hinted that the battles of the next decades, civil rights, urban renewal, and political reform, were just beginning. Chicago in the post-war era exemplified both resilience and transformation. It had survived economic collapse, war, and demographic shifts to emerge as a global city. The foundations of modern Chicago, industry, culture, infrastructure, and social complexity were firmly in place. The stage was set for the civil rights struggles, urban renewal projects, and political transformations that would define Chicago in the second half of the 20th century.